kind of things, the miracle stories of Jesus, okay? You have basically two types of miracle stories. One would be therapeutic miracles. The other one would be non-therapeutic miracles. Therapeutic miracles would be, you got a guy with a withered hand. Jesus says, let your hand be healed. Boom, the guy can use his hand. So that'd be a therapeutic miracle. Another therapeutic miracle would be early, Jesus goes up to Peter's mother-in-law. Peter had a mother-in-law. Jesus goes up to her, and basically she's got a high fever. Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law of her fever. You've got, demoniacs, the woman that was hemorrhaging blood. Jesus heals her. Those are all therapeutic miracles. A miracle that's non-therapeutic miracle would be Jesus walking on the water. He didn't heal anybody, but he walked on the water. So that would be a non-therapeutic miracle where Jesus does something like that. Or Jesus goes out in the boat and he says, be still, and the waves and the wind obey him and everything's still. That would be a non-therapeutic miracle as well. Stories about Jesus, okay? Stories about Jesus. These would be things like the Transfiguration, where there's a story about Jesus, something that Jesus did. Stories about Jesus. And then we've got sayings of Jesus. I think I was just trying to remember, but I was quoting, I think it was Jesus that said, a worker is worthy of his hire. A worker is worthy of his hire. And so Jesus has these sayings. You could say, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Those Beatitudes are kind of sayings, that things that Jesus said into little sayings, kind of sage-like, wisdom-like sayings. And then there's the Passion narrative. The Passion narrative when Jesus was beat by the soldiers and all that kind of thing. Those are kind of special stories that would be crafted. And then parables. And let me just set up a parable. If I were to say to you, just a few words, the kingdom of heaven is like, do you know that you're getting a parable next? Okay, so I'd set it up. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. Smallest of seeds, or a real small seed, grows up to be a big old plant. The birds come in the air and lodge in its branches and stuff. The parables. And so you get Jesus, the kingdom of heaven is like, that kind of thing. Parables, engaging stories, but then also mystery about the parable. Some people understand them, some people don't. So the oral, and you've got this oral that's featured by form critics, the oralness there on the form critics featuring that, as opposed to the source criticism, where the source criticism was more written documents and the disciples copying. So would the disciples know the oral stories? Would those oral stories be passed down? Jesus, what he told his disciples. Again, Jesus himself wrote what? We have nothing of the written Jesus. Jesus, in one sense, is like Socrates. Do you remember Socrates didn't really write anything? It was Plato, his student, that wrote down what Socrates, and that brings up what's called the Socratic problem. How much of what Plato wrote down is real Socrates, and how much of that is Plato putting back into Socrates' mouth what he wanted Socrates to say. So how do you separate Socrates and Plato? But here with Jesus, you've got oral and written. The disciples would have heard this. The disciples heard these stories. They would have passed these stories down orally and told, the things that they knew. They were with Jesus the whole time, the apostles and things. And so why was there this move then in the early church to move from oral stories down to written form? Why was there this shift between oral and written? And I think there's three things that come up. There's probably more, but these three things come to mind immediately. First of all, the reason why you wanted to write stuff down was the apostles were dying off. The early church faced a dilemma. The apostles, as long as the apostles were around, the apostles could say, oh, no, Jesus didn't say that, Jesus said this. And the apostles could check things and tell what was right and wrong. And the apostles then could tell stories about Jesus because they were there, they remember those stories. But the apostles were dying off. And as the apostles died off, there was a need to write down their stories in order to preserve it. So the death of the apostles, I think, in some senses, what precipitated, let me just say it this way, what precipitated the writing of the Gospels? Is it possible the death of the apostles? And they were looking at Christians who had been with Jesus dying off. And they would no longer be around to tell people the stories of Jesus. And so they wrote down the stories. And so that would be a big precipitating factor on why you want it written down. What's the problem with oral? The neat part about oral is it can be crafted and you can engage an audience with oral much more than you can with written. But the problem with oral is once you say it, it's gone, unless you got a video camera on you and you're kind of trying to preserve it that way. But otherwise, the oral is gone. You speak it, the people in the room hear it. When they go out, it's either in their head or it's not in their head, and so you lose things orally when you get passed down. So oral, the death of the apostles. Another need for writing things down was there were heretics making their way into the early church. There were heretics making their way into the early church. In Greek class now we're reading 1 John. And in 1 John they're the cessationists. They're these people who left the church. And there's this big tension because there seems to be these people who left the church are now kind of seeking to pull people out of the church. And they're trying to, they're manifesting hatred toward the believers and stuff. And John's trying to tell them, no, the believers, you love your brothers and things. And that's how you know you're a Christian, by their love. And so against these cessationists who are pulling out. Early in the church, not in the first century necessarily, maybe a proto-Gnosticism, but in the second century certainly you get Gnosticism going. And Gnosticism, it's a very, very different way of thinking about things. And so the early church needed the documents written down so that people could study them and they could get it right, as opposed to the heretics who were trying to say, no, it wasn't like this, it was like that. And then with written documents, so with the rising of heresies in the early church, you needed to have stuff written down. And then thirdly, the church just needed plain organization. The church needed organization. You had, your church initially would have been small, if certain people get saved, and there would be a small church in a house and things, it's not much of a problem. You only got 3 or 4 people, it's not much of a problem. But as the church grows, you're going to need kind of an organizational structure. You're going to need elders, you're going to need deacons, you're going to need, people to handle the finances, you're going to need people that are evangelists going out, you're going to need various types of people. So once the church starts getting structure, then you're going to have need for training of the people so that they make sure that they understand Christianity. You need to have that stuff written down. You need to have that stuff written down. Okay, there was no Google back then. You couldn't Google or go online to check stuff. And so basically you had to have it written down so that there would be kind of a uniformity to the Christianity that you're in terms of your organization, that you'd